If I could go back to 2018 when I started specializing in kayak fishing, this is what I would do differently. Let's go! Now, when I first got my fishing kayak, man, I was pumped out of my mind. It was awesome. I was up off the bank. I was out there. Every lake, every pond was my oyster. But I also know that I would have caught a lot more fish in size and in numbers if I wouldn't have made these 4 mistakes. And mistake number 1 is underutilizing my advantage as a kayak angler, which being out in the water is being one of the stealthiest things out there. The problem is with most kayaks being made out of polyethylene plastic and not many of them having sound dampeners, you could also be the loudest thing on the water if you're not paying attention. Water is an excellent transmitter of sound. And bass have sensitive hearing. They have ears, so they pick up on these sounds. So the tip here is think of sounds when it comes to fishing in 2 categories. You got your flight sounds and you got your feed sounds. These are 2 sounds I wish I would have paid attention to more when I started kayak fishing. Because there will be sounds that cause those largemouth bass to strike, and there'll also be sounds that cause those bass to bounce. The best way I can explain it right now is to have cars driving by outside. There's a lot of ambient sound taking place. And for me, this is not necessarily something that's going to get my attention. However, if my phone were to ring or I dropped a tool off my bench here, it would get my attention. And it's the same for you when you're out there kayak fishing. If you slam your lure up next to your kayak, if you throw your lure and make a huge splash on entry, if you drop your pliers on your boat, if you slam your paddle into your paddle rod holders, these could all be flight sounds. And if you don't pay attention to them or you simply think they don't matter, you could be losing out on some big bass. Now the good news is it also is feed sounds. So these are going to be all the clicks and the thumps and the rattles that many of these lures have built into them to get those largemouth bass to strike. Now there's a fine line between feed sounds and flight sounds, and so it's just something that you want to be aware of when you're starting out kayak fishing, because you definitely do not want that bass to realize that you're there before they see your lure, especially on those highly pressured lakes and ponds where we have trained those bass over the years. Mistake number 2. Now when I got into kayak fishing, like I said, I was pumped out of my mind and I went an entire season without electronics. And recently I polled the Wendell fishing community, and if you don't get those polls, I do them every single day. I ask questions about fishing. We have thousands of people who respond. It kind of gives you an idea of what's taking place in the kayak fishing community. If you're not seeing those, it's because you're not subbed. Hit the sub and you'll see those. But I polled the question, do you have a fish finder? And we had over 1,500 people vote, with 59% of you saying no and 41% of you saying yes. Now here's the thing, I'm a believer that knowledge trumps gear. However, your knowledge is not going to tell you if there's fish suspended at 20 feet below you, if you just ran over that bait ball, or how deep that water is. So having a entry-level type of fish finder is going to be a huge advantage for you if you're starting out kayak fishing. So if I could go back in time when I started, now obviously after you get your essentials, your paddle, a good personal flotation device, things like that, the next buy for me would have been an entry-level fish finder. We're not talking about minor advantage here, we're talking about major advantage. Some serious yardage to your fishing game when you have a fish finder. It used to be these things were priced through the moon, but now you can get entry-level fish finder for around $125. Now I personally highly recommend do not buy any type of fish finder under $125. I know there's some of you guys out there who might be like, hey, clowning me a little bit because you have one that works well for you. That's your personal opinion, that's totally fine. I wouldn't personally buy one under $125 for a plethora of reasons. I've done videos on this before. And if you're looking for a great entry-level fish finder, I'm going to recommend to you the one that I have. When I started out with the Garmin Striker 4, these things cost around $125, and I power that through the Naqua Pro battery kit, which I've had a lot of success with. These things, I think I got the 10 amp hour. They last for days without having to recharge it, which is especially good for me because I go out for sometimes 3-4 day trips. Now I'm not saying that $200 is not a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but I would highly recommend maybe canceling one of those monthly fishing box subscriptions and starting to save for the fish finder. You're gonna like your results. Mistake number 3, let me first acknowledge that it's very difficult when you first get into a fishing kayak to cast from that thing. You have, a lot of times you've created a kayak crate with rod holders, so you gotta miss those. Other times you gotta learn kind of the side cast, which is kind of unique. It's something you don't have to do for the bank. And some of you are actually fishing from inflatables, and you always have to be kind of cognizant of where your hook is. But I see time and time again a lot of beginner kayak anglers exercising the rainbow cast, simply just hooking up your lure and throwing it out just like you would from the bank, and it goes kerplunk in the water. And when you're from the bank, you really don't need to be thinking about any type of cast. You're just throwing your lure out and retrieving it. Now, something to think about is whenever you're bank fishing, you're throwing out to deeper water and retrieving to shallow. And its opposite is true for kayak fishing. A lot of times when you hit the bank, you're casting to shallow and retrieving to deeper. So here's the tip. A lot of times when you're throwing in the shallow, if there are bass there, and if you don't have a soft entry, those bass are going to scatter. So I highly recommend dialing in your skipping. If you dial in skipping your lure, you're simply going to be able to fish in a lot of places where many other anglers simply can't access, which a lot of times, that's where the bigs are hiding. It's gonna provide access to a lot of places fish are hiding where you can't get to when you're casting, normally, when you're pitching, when you're flipping. Low-hanging trees, brush, laydowns, deep under docks, and just don't think because you're throwing your lure next to the dock that you're getting all the fish that are there. I think a lot of times when people kind of rainbow cast next to the dock, you actually get some fish from time to time, and you might get enough bites to think that that is the strategy for getting and pulling out those fish from underneath those docks or underneath those places you can skip into. But the majority of those bass are deep under the docks, deep under those laydowns that you're simply not going to be able to access if you can't skip your lure under there. Now here's a tip: if you're going to start practicing skipping your lure, don't start doing it on the bank. You're going to end up untangling your lure from a ton of different brush, and you're going to spend all day doing that. Dial it in when you're out in open water, and I promise you, if you dial in this technique, you are going to catch so much more. Now it's kind of weird whenever you're skipping for the first time because you're really whipping that thing, probably more so than you ever have before. What you're looking for is that velocity to skip it across and skitter it across the water. And of course, adding weight or have a weighted lure that weighs more is going to add velocity. It's going to help you skip more. Using braid, it's just going to come off the reel a lot faster for you. And of course, leave a little bit of line whenever you're casting. That's going to add velocity to your skipping as well. It takes some time, but I guarantee you it'll be a fun day from you when you can see a hole that's maybe this big, and from your kayak you skip that thing under there, land it in there, and grab a big one. And the second tip of this: if you're using a bait caster and you're casting shallow, and usually by using a bait caster you have a heavier lure on, you want to be cognizant of that. If there are bass in the shallow water, you want to have a soft entry. And so instead of just throwing it, and those things are coming off at a high velocity of speed, you just don't want those to kerplunk because your bass are going to scatter. So use the bait caster advantage, which is a thumb brake. And so right before your lure is about to enter the water, go ahead and thumb brake, slow that down a bit so you have a softer entry. So the bass will actually be there when you start retrieving that lure back to your kayak. And tip number 4, I got a question for you. If you were to tip your kayak over, how much money would you lose to the bottom of the lake? I'm actually curious. Please let me know in the comments below. Now, if you're looking to buy some new gear and your girlfriend or wife won't let you, this might be the tip for you when you come home.
Oh, I tipped my kayak and all my old fishing poles fell to the bottom of the lake. I guess I need to buy some new ones.
Well, this is not for you. But if you're like me and you're on a budget and what you got is really just what you got, I would highly recommend, especially when you're starting out kayak fishing, to have a lot of your gear tethered down. Think, if I were to flip my kayak, how much of this stuff would go to the bottom of the lake, never to be found again? So tip here: leave all your expensive fishing poles and reels at home for the first couple times out as you're kind of getting used to getting into your new kayak. And tip number 2 is this: but a lot of times when you create those kayak crates with rod holders, those rod holders are really close together. And so when you reach back to get a rod, what you're not realizing is that the handle of that reel is actually pulling the one next to it out. And so when you pull that out, that one falls in the water while you have the one that you grabbed in your hand. So if you have expensive rods and reels, you want to keep that in mind, or you're going to lose that $200 to $300 combo to the bottom of the lake. And if you don't have a kayak crate with rod holders for your kayak, what in the world? These things are really awesome. You can make them. In fact, I got a video for you how to make the ultimate kayak crate with 6 rod holders.